Hi, everyone. My name is Nicollette Gooding. I am a Master's of Social Work student at the University of Toronto, currently completing my practicum with For a Safer Space. Today, I will be sharing information about sex work and the violence against women sector and how it can affect us personally and also those around us. So, what is sex work? The term sex work recognizes that sex in itself is work, and any sex in exchange for goods and services in itself is work. Many people who sell sexual services refer to the term sex worker and find the term prostitute demeaning and stigmatizing, which contributes to their exclusion from health, legal, and social services. So, why do some women do sex work? Sex workers sell sexual activities in order to earn a livelihood. The vast majority of sex workers choose to do sex work because it is the best option that they have. Many sex workers struggle with poverty and destitution and have few other options for work. Others find that sex work offers better pay and more flexible working conditions than other jobs. Some pursue sex work also to explore and express their sexuality. Often women, as a vulnerable community, see sex work as the ability to offer financial freedom, flexible working conditions, and exploration of their inner selves. Why shouldn't sex work be a crime? Criminalization of sex work compromises sex workers' health and safety by driving sex work underground. The criminalization includes everything from criminalizing the sale and purchase of sexual services to blanket prohibitions of management of the sex work itself. Criminalization makes it harder for sex workers to negotiate terms with clients, work together with other sex workers for safety and coalition, and carry condoms without fear in the fear that they will be used as evidence of prostitution. Sex workers in many settings report extreme levels of violence and harassment in connection with their work, including from clients, managers, and police. Criminalization makes it difficult for sex workers to report rights violations, especially to the police, because they are vulnerable to incarceration, further abuse, and retribution. This perpetuates stigma, violence, impunity, which further endangers sex workers' health and overall safety. What's wrong with the laws that target only the clients of sex workers? So many opponents of sex work acknowledge that the harm that results from the criminalization of sex workers and their work and a support system that criminalizes buyers and third parties, such as managers or brothel owners, but not sex workers themselves. This kind of criminalization seeks to end a demand for sex work while treating sex workers as victims rather than criminals. This model actually perpetuates stigma against sex workers, leading to discrimination within social services, housing, healthcare, as it doesn't actually address the fundamental key issue of the criminalization of the driving sex work underground and pushing sex workers away from actually being able to safely access supports and services. The criminalization of clients and third parties hasn't been effective in achieving its intended goal of abolishing or even reducing sex work. In France, for example, the purchase of sexual services was criminalized in 2016, and 2 years later, a study demonstrated that the impact on sex workers was much more severe, including major deterioration of living conditions and greater exposure to violence. In Sweden, where criminalization of the purchase of sexual services was introduced in 1999, online advertisements for sexual services has increased exponentially in the last decade. What is the decriminalization of sex work? This would mean the removal of criminal and administrative penalties that apply specifically to sex work, creating an enabling environment for a sex worker that is understanding of their health and safety needs. For decriminalization to be meaningful, it must be accompanied by a recognition of sex work as work by allowing sex workers to be governed by labor laws and protection similar to other jobs. While decriminalization does not resolve all challenges that sex workers face, It is a very necessary condition to realize sex workers' human rights. The Open Society Foundation, for example, supports decriminalization of sex work as the best way to protect the health and human rights of the sex workers themselves. So, what is the difference between human trafficking and sex work? Human trafficking is seen more as a human rights violation involving the threat or use of force, abduction, deception, or other forms of coercion for the purpose of exploitation. This may include forced labor, sexual exploitation, slavery, and more. Sex work, on the other hand, is more of a consensual transaction between adults where the act of selling or buying services is not in a violation of their human rights. Conflating trafficking with sex work can be very harmful and counterproductive. Sex work organizers oppose exploitation, and many argue that the most effective way to address exploitation, including human trafficking itself, is to strengthen workers' understanding and rights to address these economic injustices. Precarious work, restrictive migration policies, and gender inequality all contribute to the greater vulnerability and exploitation of sex workers. Sex work is legal in Canada, although the purchase of the service is not. In May 2014, Bill C-36 was passed in the House of Commons to amend the way in which the Criminal Code addresses voluntary prostitution activities between two consenting adults. The introduction of Bill C-36 created two criminal offenses in regards to prostitution, prohibiting the purchase of sexual services in any time or place, and prohibiting advertising the sale of other sexual services. Under Bill C-36, sex workers are considered victims of sexual exploitation, which highly impacts women and girls. Canadian sex workers do experience extremely high rates of sexual, physical, and economic exploitation and violence because of the work and how it is criminalized and stigmatized. For example, many sex workers are hesitant to report acts of violence against them, and the perpetrators know this. To hold sex workers responsible for violence is victim blaming and plays into anxieties around women's sexuality and the sexuality of men who have sex with men. 1 in 5 sex workers have experienced physical or sexual violence, and it has also been found that 45 to 75% of sex workers have experienced violence in their lifetime. If you or someone you know requires support for their experience of violence as a sex worker, locate your local trauma-informed survivor center in your province for services offered and applicable support. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I hope it was helpful. And take care.